The international system is facing accelerated transitions as competition between the great powers intensifies. Join this important dialogue with the Kingston Consortium on International Security.
All right, good morning. So next we have Major General Scott Clancy, and he'll lead our first panel discussion this morning on international security challenges in the North, and his full biography can be found in the program. Sir?
Hey, good morning. So this is the challenge that was given to us on panel 1. It's in your program as well. I think it's trying to set the stage from a security point of view for all the rest of the pieces of the conference. And we're very lucky to have 3 excellent panelists, not me, them, the academic brains behind panel number 1. First of all, in the middle here, Dr. Michele Devlin, Professor of Environmental Security at the U.S. Army War College, Professor of Arctic Health and Human Security at the National Science Foundation Uni-Arctic Center. I think that's really, really cool. But she's also a doctor of public health and a registered nurse and an EMT, and has lived for 6 months just recently on the North Slope of Alaska with the Inuit people to try and get after those things that are directly affecting their lives. Extensive military experience in the health, law enforcement, and disaster relief communities, and that's Dr. Michele Devlin. Right next to her on her left is Dr. James Morton, Assistant Research Professor from the Center for Alaska Native Health Research at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks. And I know James because he was the Native Affairs Advisor to us in Alaskan Command and the Alaska NORAD region when I served up in Alaska. Relationships with military and civilian peoples, especially so focused on the SOF areas, drawing on his extensive SOF as a SOF operator, infantry and military intelligence background, is what James is into, partnering in the defense of North America with those indigenous populations. I think that's key to drawing those linkages, some of which we saw from the recent presentation. So welcome, James. And then our last panel member, Professor Will Greaves, Assistant Professor of UVic, the University of Victoria in International Relations, really focused on the intersection of global security, environmental policy, Canadian foreign policy and climate change, energy and indigenous issues, and how energy extraction is done in the circumpolar North. Also a co-lead of the Climate and Environmental for North American Arctic Defense and Security Network. So really well positioned. What we're going to do is 15-minute presentations from each one of our 3 panelists, and then we're going to do questions and answers for the rest of the program. Without further ado, I'll invite our first panelist, Dr. Michele Devlin, to come up and deliver her presentation.
Thank you so much, sir. Good morning. Thank you very much for inviting me here today. I'm very, very honored and want to echo the comments of the previous speakers. Thank you so much to all of you for what you do in your areas, for contributing to these important security strategic discussions on the high north and the Arctic. So part of my role this morning was to give you a brief overview, sort of the big picture, the 30,000, 80,000 foot viewpoint even of how climate change is changing the human element of the Arctic, of the circumpolar world. I'm sure we all are very aware and following a lot of the trends from a geographic standpoint, what's going on with climate change and how it's melting the ice pack and glaciers and permafrost and these types of things. And I'm sure we're, of course, being more focused on military and security issues, weapons and strategies and special ops and all of this. We so rarely take a chance to look at what's going on with the humans, the people that live in the Arctic and these populations. Where are they today? And most importantly, as we're looking at futures, trends, where are these populations going and what we expect to see, what we believe we'll see in these future decades coming up because of climate change. So to give you, again, more of the circumpolar world view, the human terrain view of populations in the Arctic. And this, unfortunately, is an area of research, actually, that we are not looking enough at. Again, we're not really focusing on the humans and the different cultures, again, where they are today and where they're going in the future with climate change. But as you can see already in just the first hour or so of the conference, how we're working in conversations related to security and how that's tied to economic development, right? And these are very much necessary, and they go together. So one of the big challenges in the Arctic, in the circumpolar world as a whole, is that very few people live there. We're currently only at about 4 million people in the entire circumpolar world. And if we look at security issues, economic development, these kinds of things, we expect that those numbers are going to have to climb, especially as the climate warms and as it becomes more accessible. Currently in the circumpolar world, the high north, it depends how it's defined, but roughly 1 in 10 is indigenous, maybe 1 in 8. If you look at key areas in the circumpolar world, in the Arctic, those percents of indigenous populations jump way up. Certainly when I came off slope recently, the North Slope in the American high north, a lot of the indigenous villages that I worked in, they are 95% or more indigenous. Even Barrow, Utqiagvik, 70% indigenous. So if you were working in the high north in some of these key communities, understanding and recognizing local populations, indigenous issues, indigenous needs is going to be central to functioning there. And our two speakers following me will do a deeper dive on this issue. The other thing we're seeing, and this is one of the areas that I focus a lot of time on, is related to environmental migration, what the popular press might call climate change refugees or climate migrants, environmental migrants. The big picture, as the world warms, we expect to see more and more people fundamentally moving north on the globe, as well as to the far south on the globe, right? We're actually already seeing these trends happen. There is a reversal. There are, for instance, even in the United States, people that are starting to retire up north along the Great Lakes and even southern Alaska, very specifically because they want to avoid extreme heat, lots of disasters that are going on, for instance, in the southern U.S., coastal areas. I was working up in Barrow again, Utqiagvik, about almost 15% of the population right now in the North Slope of Alaska is actually made up of Asian and Pacific Islanders, or blended, intermarried with indigenous populations. Okay, so when we look at human migration, there are always pull factors and then push factors. The Arctic for a long time has had a powerful pull factor of high salaries. They need labor. A lot of companies, they don't have enough workers, not enough people live there, so high salaries are usually available. But increasingly, we're seeing push factors also drive people to the high north as they're coming in from places. I worked on a daily basis with Hawaiians, Tongans, Samoans, Filipinos, Thais, Laos, many different populations from islands and nations in Asia and the Pacific that literally are going underwater or having repeat climate disasters. Their economies are becoming decimated, so they have greater push factors to leave their home communities and go up north where the salaries are higher. We expect those trends to just continue over time. Over time, it will become even more significant. We're already talking about economic development, lack of population, lack of labor up north. We're looking at the increases most likely in fly-in, fly-out laborers. The models we see already in the U.S., Canada, certainly Prudhoe Bay, Dead Horse, that area where you've got oil workers, gas workers coming in and out on, for 3 weeks, 4 weeks at a time. Energy, construction, military deployments, and others. There were certainly medical people like myself. We were coming in and out. I was actually based over there. A lot of my colleagues were flying in and out every 4 weeks to provide labor up there. Surprisingly, even homesteading populations. Again, when we look at climate change, we take it way, 80,000-foot view, look way far out, the year 2100. We are expecting that the most productive area on Earth to grow crops as we know them and as we currently consume them, things like wheat and staples like that, it's going to be the Arctic region. So northern Russia, the northern third of Russia, Arctic Russia, Greenland, northern Canada, these areas are going to become the primary area where crops can be produced, Well, Russia, as well as China, they are already looking at that, and they are actually, Russia actually has Chinese homesteaders that are coming in and helping settle and farm parts of their Arctic as it melts and as it becomes more amenable to farming. We expect those trends to continue. And anytime we look at areas that deal with migration, larger flows of workers, we expect to see unique gender patterns, unique age patterns in communities that we have to be tracking. A lot of times with these types of labor situations, you'll have men, for instance, coming in and out. So you may have communities that are heavily dominated by men, and others dominated by women, and others dominated by older people because the younger people have left for labor. Okay, so these types of situations are very, very much increasing, and overall, greater human density. The Arctic, as you know, is really the least dense, is a region, the least dense area on Earth other than Antarctica, but that's going to increase, right? As it opens up, more labor is needed, so these communities will become more and more dense from a population standpoint, but if they are not being developed, there's nowhere to house them. And again, having just come off slope up in northern Alaska and Barrow, not enough housing, not enough infrastructure, and a severe impediment to workers. In fact, in Alaska, it's really, the growth is flat in the state except for the indigenous populations who are increasing in size. And we are seeing growth, fertility rates increase in a number of our indigenous populations in the circumpolar world. So it presents a number of different interesting security dynamics. And again, we often don't look enough at the human terrain of the areas of responsibility that we have from a security standpoint. But fundamentally, what we need to understand is that the people within those populations, they are citizens usually of those countries where those AORs are. In fact, I was even asked that frequently by the local indigenous populations. Does America understand that we are citizens, that we are American, and we're concerned about security issues? We're concerned about the Russians attacking the Ukraine, and we could be next because we border Russia, right? And they literally said those kinds of things to me. But we can expect to see within our security AORs, fundamentally as we go over time, a much greater diversity of populations. The Arctic is actually incredibly diverse already. In fact, we are looking, if you look just at indigenous populations, indigenous languages in the north, it's anywhere from 40 to 90 different languages, just indigenous. If you throw in new immigrant and climate change migrants and foreign workers and these types of groups, that number jumps up tremendously. In fact, the North Slope, when I looked just a few months ago, they were up to 40 different languages. And that's not including the indigenous languages that were there. Those were migrant workers, migrant laborers. Okay, obviously, if we're going to be looking at this part of the world, the dominance of indigenous populations, again, issues related to self-determination, greater rights, greater control over that, and how that affects then development in that area. These can be incredibly complex areas to work in, not just because of the extreme environment, the temperatures, the remoteness, the tyranny of distance, all of that, but because of the complex human nature of these different groups that are living there, different languages, different cultures, different literacy levels, different beliefs, different practices, different values as they relate to many different aspects of society. More potential, we were actually looking at some of these areas when I was up there, more potential for issues, for instance, human trafficking in remote areas, issues that affect women in particular. We heard gender mentioned a number of times already this morning, transnational criminal organizations, money laundering, movement back and forth of foreign agents, things like that. These are remote areas and yet incredibly fluid in terms of the populations that come and go, and even more so in the future. So again, future growth, much greater density and growth in human populations means that there are more targets right, from enemies. And again, the local population that I worked with up in these native villages, they brought this up with me frequently, and they said, again, does the American military know that we are concerned, we are scared that we could be targeted in Barrow and Utqiagvik, in our airports, only main airport up there in the North Slope, Prudhoe Bay, oil resources. You'll have more targets, fundamentally, that can be attacked. More vulnerable communities, again, with limited resources to support others as they come in. And we are definitely already seeing the need for communities, in some cases, because of climate change, to be pushed back, to be relocated, to be moved, because they cannot survive anymore. Their soil, their land is eroding. They're right on the edge of the Arctic Ocean, for instance, and getting more volatile storms. And again, anytime you have this level of populations coming in and out and cultures changing, acculturation and challenges can increase social tension within communities. So if we're looking at some special populations for, civ-mil relationships, security partnerships, economic partnerships, and others, there's a number of different groups that we can be doing more in terms of outreach, in terms of engagement, in terms of being humble and learning from these populations. A lot of these groups here have lived in the Arctic, if not for hundreds, if not thousands of years, literally. And others are more recently there, but have become very, very comfortable operating in remote, harsh, and extreme environments. So in terms of civ-mil relationships, obviously the indigenous partnerships will dominate. But remember, there is diversity within diversity. Not all indigenous groups are the same, and not all people within a population are the same. You've got different values. You've got different, different subgroups. So it takes time to learn from, to visit, to engage with these different groups. But certainly when we look at the American High North, the U.S., the whaling captains, the whaling crews up there in the North Slope, a tremendous amount of expertise in operating on the water, on the ice packs. They know this, they live this. Again, please do not leave out women in community engagement, in developing partnerships. An example, the elder women in not all, but a number of the different tribal groups that I interacted with were expert skin sewers, traditional skin sewers. In other words, they were the ones that knew how to survive 60 below weather because of the types of clothing they could make and wear. And in fact, just a few weeks ago, I gave a keynote presentation to the Naval Protective Textile Board on partnerships between the U.S. military and the women's skin sewers, indigenous skin sewers, and the level of knowledge that they can provide. And so they're moving on that right now, looking at that. I remembered a lot of these indigenous villages, and I can speak as an American to the American Native villages. They function just like most other rural communities do in the U.S., and I was working in Iowa for 30 years. They have rural EMS, right? They've got volunteer fire, volunteer police, you've got village security officers in and out. But those are partners that know those communities very well. They are the first responders for anything local as well as anything major that may be going out on the tundra that we should be partnering with. In the villages on the North Slope, they are indigenous, 100%. In Barrow, in Utqiagvik, when I left there a few months ago, the Barrow Volunteer Fire Department, EMS Fire Department, 100% Samoan. Okay, so Pacific Islanders were dominating in that particular group. Bush pilots, any of you doing aviation, looking at air operations, they are phenomenal. The bush pilots, the commuter pilots are a wealth of knowledge for how to function in the air and land and these types of things. They want to help. Any given time, we have thousands of fishing vessels, private fishing vessels out in the Bering Straits and different parts of the Arctic Ocean, Chukchi Sea, and depending on the time of year in all these areas. We should be working with these fishermen. actually, when I was Lori and some of the others up from the Ted Stevens Center, they were part of the group that put on a terrific conference a few months ago in May and looking at partnerships up in the Arctic. I think the fishing crews actually had, I think it was the head of their association, came in and spoke to the military people, said, why aren't you connecting with us? We have thousands of our fishermen out there. They're the eyes, they are the ears of the sea. We can help you with your security concerns, with your observations. You know what? The Chinese do. With their fishermen, they do, right? In South China Sea, and their fishermen are actually armed, so they take it even one step farther, right? But they were asking to help. They wanted to help. Remote area medical crews, people like me that do remote area medicine, we come in and out. There's a huge amount of interest and willingness to help. And we get, Jerome Burkhead, we do COVID. We do COVID in the indigenous villages. What does COVID equity and vaccine equity look like in indigenous villages? We're the ones actually working on that on a daily basis with the local populations. We're very willing to help on those issues. New migrants, first responders. And remember, certainly in the state of Alaska, if you're looking at the U.S. high north, Alaska has the highest percentage of veterans in the country. Right? Very, very military-centered state. These people want to help of many different ethnic backgrounds, many different cultural backgrounds, and they can really help us improve what we're functioning there, rather than just surviving in the Arctic, but thriving in the Arctic, making it a home, and actually being very comfortable with that. Yes. And so final comments, lots of different opportunities for civ-mil relationships, can help with search and rescue, EMS supplies, coastal, having folks assist as coastal sensors, maritime sensors, environmental sensors, meteorological sensors, sociocultural sensors. Any of these types of skills are incredibly valuable to the military, incredibly valuable information for people, and many different opportunities for us to partner with locals, all the way from very simple, easy engagements and meetings, talking circles, things like this, all the way to more formal programs, as certainly the Canadians are very familiar with, the Canadian Rangers, our former Alaska Territorial Guard program. And again, one way to do this is not just to work with local communities as volunteers, but to actually contract with them and provide them with incentives, financial and others, for their long-term participation with the military. So thank you.
Good morning. Just wanted to say thank you to Dr. Michael Lynch for the opportunity to be here to share with you some perspectives. What I'd like to do is take what Michele has done and kind of drill it down into the North American Arctic as a sub-region. And I just want to acknowledge that first, I'm not a native. I am a Vermonter out of New England. And I carry a predominantly U.S. perspective. So my experiences are in the United States. I'll try to bridge as a North American Arctic, but I just want to do those couple of acknowledgments. So, as you see on here on the question is, how are the North American indigenous people critical to the calculus in securing the North American Arctic? And what I'd like to do, next slide, or next piece, go ahead, is break it down into kind of three groups, and then talk about a transformation. How as operators, planners, policymakers, how can we begin to kind of conceptualize this contribution in terms of framing it in terms of the criticality, but also how do we engage it in a conversation? So the first one is the sovereignty that I listed here, and that is the idea in the United States anyways, is we had Marshall Supreme Court 1831, Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, as identifying Native people as a sovereign people. an entity that is, U.S. citizen, as we talked about earlier about the citizenship, but also have a sense of sovereignty, or what I refer to as internal or limited sovereignty. And then that there is a cultural identity and traditional practices, and that these are centric around subsistence lifestyle. And then the place and history that I often refer to as time immemorial, that they have been there for thousands and thousands of years. And so indigenous people, part of my challenge is that sometimes I talk in this vernacular of them, and I don't want to do that, yet I do want to do that because there's a sense of limitation that has been historical. Slide, please. Next. So, there is the indigenous people. It's important for, I think, for me to communicate to the community or emphasize as a non-native is that the many indigenous communities have a set of knowledge and understanding that is a place-based centric perspective, a paradigmatic reference point that is different than a Eurocentric perspective, and that sometimes we have difficulties in being able to understand different worldviews because of that paradigmatic type of difference, and that they have a sense of domain awareness, of being aware. So Michele was talking about the sensor capacity, but there's different aspects of sensor capacity, and I'm also kind of cautious as I'm saying that, right? This is almost this kind of utilitarian relationship that I'm not necessarily advocating, but really there is a shared sense of responsibility that in my communication with Native communities is that we're all concerned about defending the homeland. We're all concerned about food security. We're all concerned about how do we protect the northern border. So there's this kind of shared accountability or shared focus that we can collaborate and work with. So when I say that domain awareness is, again, it's the kind of the sense of shared responsibility, and that leads to the contribution to security. How are we providing security on multiple domains? Next piece, please. And so I introduced, that concept of sovereignty and limited sovereignty or internal sovereignty, and there's accountability to it. So in the United States, and I think when I look at JTFN here in Canada, I see a more developed set of practices in the engagement with the Aboriginal communities versus the United States, where we still, I think, are more kind of looking at an asset focus. But there's this kind of recognition of that we do have accountability to the sovereignty of indigenous communities, and that there's a political power structure piece to that, and that as in the United States anyways, and particularly in Alaska, which is different than the lower 48, is that you have the ANSCA 1971 agreement, where it's the Alaska Native Settlements Claims Agreement, where the indigenous people were able to identify corporations as a way to secure land, and that tribes have federal recognition, but they don't own land, which is a problem set that we're a friction point that we have in the United States. But there's a sense of emerging legitimacy that we're seeing in the 21st century. So just recently, the CARES Act in the United States Supreme Court argued or decided that Alaska Native corporations do have a tribal entity and have the ability to secure funds from the CARES Act. And so that legitimizes the corporation, but that also makes things a little bit more confounded because they're for profit. And so we're getting into an environment where some of the complexities are creating friction points on how do we navigate the relationships as we look at indigenous communities being part of the national security framework. And recently, just last week, the United States published, the National Strategy for Arctic Region, and 2 of the 5 principles. One of them is that there's a requirement for consultation with Alaskan Native tribes and people. And then the other is that there is a requirement for whole government for decision-making and work. And so in the United States anyways, we're emerging and beginning to develop further some of those policy reference points or structures that gives legitimacy to the sovereignty of indigenous people in North America. And so I would argue 4 buckets that I would encourage you kind of think about. And we heard it earlier, in terms of the economic development, that there is an economic component to this to be able to fund and kind of actualize different efforts, infrastructure. In Alaska, we have villages that don't have safe water, that don't have sewage systems, that have to use a honey pot. It's really third world development kind of lifestyle, and yet U.S. citizens. And so there's an incongruence with how people are living. 86% of the population in Alaska are Native people outside of the city areas. So that's predominantly indigenous people. And there's the lack of infrastructure, that quality of life is, I would argue, marginal. The other is social accountability. That's the second bucket. So social accountability, again, is some of it is recognizing and attending to the historical traumas that Native people have experienced, and how do we begin to acknowledge and apologize and make reparations to some of those behaviors that governmental, at the governmental level, military level, that we need to address and to begin to engage in a more corrective direction. The third bucket is political purposefulness. And what I mean by that is that there's a political power structure. And in Alaska, the Alaska Native community has a lot of political power, influence. So shaping who gets elected in the Senate, who's elected and making decisions in the U.S. House of Congress. So there's political capital that is emerging that's important for us to consider. And then the last, fourth bucket is the cultural autonomy. The lifestyle is a subsistence lifestyle in Alaska in particular. And so decisions and choices, whether fish regulation, China absorption or capturing salmon, those are important aspects that indigenous community think about. And last year, we had an incident with Russia where they were, the Bristol Corporation or Bristol area had a lot of boats out in fishing salmon, but had to leave and cost them billions of dollars because of the Russians were conducting naval operations. And so we were able to start sorting that out, but it was that friction point that has major implications on the security front. And so as you think about and have discussions, as we think about indigenous people as part of the security framework, it's being able to maybe use these 4 buckets as a way to kind of organize and legitimize the sovereignty. How do we look at the social responsibility as well as economic development? And how do we begin to start creating other narratives? And what I mean by that is that how do we have experiences and engagement with Native communities and that begin to script a new dialogue or new narrative that is collaborative, that share that sense of national security, that securing the North American Arctic is in all our best interest, and that we all have some level of legitimacy to that process. And as we do that and engage that, there's an internal reorientation of diversity, inclusivity, and equity. So I just leave that with you to consider those 4 buckets as we begin to frame how the indigenous people have a role and a part and a criticality dimension to our national security. Thank you.
Good. All right. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here, to Professor Von Hatke and her team for the amazing organization and the kind invitation. Personally speaking, it's wonderful to see so many friends and colleagues and collaborators in person after a long and difficult pandemic. I know many of us are done with COVID-19, but COVID-19 is not quite done with us, and so it's nonetheless wonderful to have the opportunity to be here and to see so many of you in person. My mind is really spinning from what we've already heard this morning. I study climate change and energy on one side, and I study climate change and human security in the Arctic on the other side. So between Mr. Hyder's comments and my fellow panelists, there's so much to say. But I'm actually speaking on a slightly different topic today, because as a scholar of the Arctic and as a scholar of climate change, I've nonetheless found myself for the last 8 months really fixating on the outbreak of war in Eastern Europe. And it has caused me to reread a lot of history, and it's caused me to reflect and to increasingly incorporate into my writing reflections on what this war and the politics that surround it means in the Arctic region. And I've come to the conclusion that they're intimately linked. And so today I will be speaking a little bit about Ukraine, and I will certainly be speaking centrally about Russia, which has such a complex relationship both to the broader international order, and then of course very specifically plays a critical linchpin role in the regional order within the Arctic. So this is my first time workshopping this particular set of arguments, and so as ever I look forward to the discussions and the questions afterward. Thank you. I'd like to start by presenting two pieces of an argument that I've previously published and which I think situate the specific comments I'd like to make today. The first of these is an argument that I first published in 2019 in the Arctic Yearbook, which essentially argues that we are living through the midst of the fragmentation of the Arctic as a security region. And so there's a lot of theory that kind of backgrounds this, but the long and short of it is that since the end of the Cold War, the geopolitics and international cooperation in the Arctic have been guided by a vision of one Arctic, a positive and inclusive vision for pan-Arctic cooperation that sought to overcome the limitations and divisions of the Cold War and integrate the Western Arctic states with Russia into an effective system of regional cooperation. And with tremendous success. I think it must be acknowledged, and in fact, as perhaps that success recedes somewhat into the past, it will become increasingly important for us to recognize and to give credit to the many significant achievements that were accomplished during this time, most notably, of course, the establishment of the Arctic Council and all of the exceptional work that the Council has undertaken since its establishment. But I think even prior to the crisis, the war that has broken out in 2022, we have been witnessing the demise of the one Arctic concept, and in practice, in the physical realities of the Arctic, the end of the integrated Arctic region. I think this has been driven by two major processes. The first is climate change, which by virtue of eroding the shared ecological foundations of the Arctic system has undermined much of the commonality that allowed the 8 Arctic states to collaborate and to recognize themselves as having a set of linked interests. More broadly, I think climate change has actually undermined, and as the Arctic continues to warm and to transform, has also undermined, and will increasingly so, the idea of the Arctic as a single place, that the warmer it gets and the more ecosystems in the Arctic begin to resemble those at southern latitudes, the less Arctic it is, and therefore the less regionally distinct it will be, which impedes the ability to have pan-Arctic cooperation instead of the Arctic being essentially divided into subregions which become northern extensions of other geopolitical regions. And so for this reason, combined with the increasing geopolitical tension that we've seen long prior to 22, primarily, of course, between Russia and the other Western Arctic states, but also, I think it must be said, between the United States and various allies under the previous president and the previous administration, that we have seen the Arctic break into these 3 distinct regions: the North American Arctic, which links, of course, Alaska, northern Canada, and Greenland, not only because of geography, but because of commonalities, small, remote, disparate communities, quite isolated, quite impoverished, in many respects, quite segregated from the southern centers of gravity of their respective societies. The European Arctic, the high Arctic, where I've been privileged to spend time and to work, which frankly looks virtually nothing like the North American Arctic, which has in many ways not much in common with the North American Arctic, which is a place of established communities, mid-sized cities, high quality of life, integrated economies with their southern centers of gravity, larger populations relative to the national population overall, and of course a distinct security situation being both on the periphery of Europe and directly on the border of Russia. The third subregion, of course, is the Eurasian Arctic, the vast expanse of the Russian North and the Russian Far East, in which Russia, of course, is the most prominent player, but where we also see significant involvement of major Asian actors, notably China, who are quite openly hungering after the resource wealth and the energy resources in particular of the Russian Federation. I predict that as a result of these two processes, climate change and geopolitics, actors and institutions in the Arctic will increasingly shift from a pan-regional, pan-Arctic focus to sub-regional forms of activity. So this isn't a prescription that the Arctic is inherently prone to conflict or that cooperation will break down in the region, but the cooperation will increasingly happen within these sub-regions because of their distinct interests, because of their distinct priorities. As a result of all of this, the idea of Arctic exceptionalism, the idea of the Arctic as a coherent, holistic region in which all state actors and non-state actors, including indigenous peoples, are united in common cause, in cooperation, in the pursuit of peace and stability, will unfortunately become, I think, increasingly rare and will ultimately vanish as a result of these various pressures. Next slide, thank you. The second component of my argument is what I call the new Arctic geopolitics, which is very much informed by the events of this year and which I published with the Royal United Services Institute in the United Kingdom, where we now see an Arctic that is fundamentally partitioned into two regions. We see an Arctic divided into two almost equal halves between the A7, the Arctic 7 bloc of Western capitalist democracies, who now also will all be NATO allies, an incredibly strong and important political community that controls just under 50% of the Arctic region, facing off with their belligerent, their foe, their enemy, the Russian Federation, which of course also controls approximately half the the Arctic region, half its population, half its coastline. As a result of various factors converging, the new Arctic geopolitics has three features which will challenge that post-Cold War one Arctic order. This includes competition amongst Arctic regional institutions, the primacy of the Arctic Council as the premier forum for Arctic cooperation will likely become increasingly strained. We already see other challengers, notably the Arctic Circle Forum, for pan-Arctic primacy, but I think we will see, as we already are, the emergence of very important, very robust sub-regional organizations, sub-regional nodes of activity that, again, may well bring important benefits to their specific regions, but will eat away on some level of the idea of the Arctic as a single coherent region. There will be, and already is, I think, by default, a greater role for NATO in the Arctic region. As Professor Von Hatke said in her comments this morning, Canada has historically resisted this and has not been a strong supporter of a greater NATO role in the region. And I agree that the Secretary General's visit this summer likely augurs a change in that stance. We've already seen the Nordic allies be strong proponents of a stronger NATO role. And I think the reality of the war in Ukraine and the deep commitment that many of the Western Arctic states have made to the territorial integrity and defense of Ukraine means that NATO will have a role in the defense of the Northern allies, and that we should expect to see a greater role in the region as a result. This comes with it something of a Trojan horse, though, because NATO, of course, has the Arctic 7 among its members, but then many non-Arctic states, many powerful and important European countries in particular. And so a greater role for NATO in the Arctic also entails a greater role for countries such as Germany, countries such as the United Kingdom, countries such as France, non-Arctic states that may well embrace the opportunity to play a greater role in Arctic politics. The flip side of that, of course, is that Russia's isolation in the international system has deepened its dependence upon China. And as a result of that, we can likely expect China to increase its investment, to increase its involvement in the management of the Eurasian Arctic subregion as Russia becomes increasingly dependent upon them for finance capital, as well as, of course, a market for their energy products. So the result of all this is that climate change and geopolitical competition, I think, are the necessary conditions for the new Arctic geopolitics. But I would suggest that we very much see the proximate cause of a quite public and quite violent fragmentation of the Arctic region as a result of Russia's aggression in Ukraine, which I'll turn to now. So the future of cooperation in the Arctic. I'm foolish enough, and I guess early career enough, to be prepared to stand up here in public and make these predictions as an active war is underway and as these massive unknowns are circulating around us. So make of that what you will. But I'd like to qualify two assumptions that this argument that I'm about to present is based on. The first assumption is that Russian military goals in Ukraine will be unsuccessful. There's been a lot of media coverage of this. There's been a lot of analysis of this. Russia has clearly failed in its initial battle plans, its strategic objectives to capture Kyiv, to install a puppet regime. The rapid fall of the Ukrainian government was not forthcoming. And we see Russia now mired in a strategic and tactical mess of its own making, with quite few, I think, reasonable prospects of conventional military success on the battlefield. So thinking of what the future of Arctic cooperation may look like, one of the assumptions that I'm starting with is that Russia ultimately will fail in its military objectives in Ukraine and will be negotiating from that position of relative weakness. The second assumption is that the war in Ukraine will end without the use of nuclear weapons. And here, all I have to say is that I hope this is the case. I'm not a nuclear expert, but that there seems to be sound reasons, not least of which is the strong position that President Biden and his administration have taken to deter the use of nuclear weapons by the Russian state. I think we should hope this for any number of reasons, but for my purposes, I'm simply going to assume that the war will resolve without the use of nuclear weapons by Russia on the battlefield. And so in light of those two assumptions, the question then becomes, how do we engage with Russia once the war in Ukraine is over? How do the other Arctic states, how do the institutions of Arctic politics engage with this country that has so flagrantly violated the international order, that has committed war crimes and humanitarian atrocities, that has sought to shred 80 years of stability that has been produced in the post-Second World War period? And here I think we have some uncomfortable realities. And the first of these is that regardless of the outcome in Ukraine, Russia will remain the foremost Arctic state. Russia alone has half the Arctic. And we have to separate here the whole illegitimacy of Russia's claims to Ukrainian territory from the legitimacy of Russia's claims in the Arctic, where 50% of the land, 50% of the coastline, 50% of the population, and more than 50% of the resources are in undisputed Russian territory. So no matter what the outcome in Ukraine, Russia will remain the indispensable Arctic state. And any prospect of pan-Arctic cooperation, which is vitally needed on a host of issues, not least of which is climate change, will require Russian involvement. So here I think that looking forward to a post-war engagement with Russia, we can expect that there will be a need for confidence-building measures. We can expect that there will be a need to rebuild transparency and trust between the Western militaries, the Western Arctic states, and their Russian counterparts. And I think that as with the closing years of the Cold War, there's a valuable role that scientific and environmental diplomacy can play in this regard. This is a well-known story. I have backup slides if anybody would like to ask questions during the Q&A. But famously, you know, the Cold War comes to a close in significant part because of the Murmansk Initiative undertaken by former Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev and the opening for cooperation between the West and Russia, which took place in the Arctic, where the Arctic was understood to provide opportunities and incentives for cooperation on primarily environmental and cultural issues that provided a useful forum for dialogue and negotiation and the building of better relationships between Cold War adversaries. I think something very similar is in the offing in a post-Ukrainian war context, where the necessity to engage Russia on questions of climate change, the necessity to engage Russia on questions of transboundary pollution and other environmental contaminants in the Arctic region, as well as opportunities to try to engage Russia in a dialogue related to issues such as indigenous rights, related to economic investment and energy development and sustainable economic growth, all provide valuable potential opportunities where flipping the script, where we have often understood external events and external conflicts to have the potential to spill over into the Arctic, we may be able to see the Arctic providing an opportunity to help mend fences between Russia and the West because of the clear interest of the A7 and Russia to negotiate in the future. To conclude, I think we have an interesting historical question to ask ourselves here, which is which model should we seek to implement to re-enter Russia into the international community as a defeated militaristic power once it has finally been forced to withdraw from Ukrainian territory. Here there are different historical models, but the two that I think are most compelling are post-Napoleonic France in the early 19th century and post-Imperial Germany in the interwar period after World War I. In the former instance, a European great power under Napoleon attempted domination of the continent, inflicted massive military destruction and suffering, ultimately was defeated by a coalition of its enemies, and yet, after a period of effective probation, was allowed to re-enter the European system of states, was allowed to resume its place as a great power around the table of the European great powers, and played a responsible role subsequently for a century during the Concert of Europe period up until the outbreak of the First World War. Conversely, of course, Imperial Germany, after its defeat in World War I, was stigmatized, was made a pariah, was ostracized from full membership in the international community, and all this served to do was foment a generation of grievance that ultimately paved the way to a second, even worse conflict 20 years later. I think there are clear historical parallels between these two cases, and we should ask ourselves which of them is in our own best interest and in the interest of global peace and security for us to pursue. Thank you very much.
Okay, so what we're going to move to now is questions and answers. I've put up a few Scott Clancy questions, just because that's what I do, to try and spark some ideas in your minds, but we want to hear from you. Are there any questions from the room? Right here.
Good morning. I'm a retired military officer. I used to be an air weapons controller on the Dew Line and the Pine Tree Line. My question is for you. Yes, have you looked at what's happening in Russia in the Arctic right now with the development of the radar horizon and also the turbine that's in the water? Have you come across anything like that yet? The sunflower radar is extremely important.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on the sunflower radar and why it's so important.
Okay. During the Cold War, I'm that old, okay? During the Cold War, as an electronic technologist, we look at radars because it gives us a fairly good idea of the capacity for a military strategy. When you look at the horizon right now, it has three purposes. One of them is nuclear prediction coming from the United States or Canada. The second one has to do with Navy, which was very unusual with our old radars, the FPS-27. Now they can see Navy and they can see air. So these are the three things. They started to build them 3 years ago. And the construction is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's what I was wondering if any of you, military, have ever heard or saw it in the last 2 years. Am I the only one that had looked at that, being a techie? So this is what I'm wondering. Did you come across anything like that?
I mean, there's been a lot of discussion about Russian investment in military infrastructure in the far north and the far east over recent years. There's been a lot of debates over the purpose and intent behind those kinds of investments, whether essentially they're defensive of Russia's northern territory and the Northern Sea route, or whether or not they have offensive intent towards the United States or other Arctic neighbors. Is that what you're referring to? I think it's certainly something that military analysts and defense analysts have observed and continue to pay close attention to and debate perhaps on some level what's happening in northern Russia.
Yeah, if I can also add on to that too, so yeah, I mean, there's a strong recognition about the level of investments that Russia has made into the Arctic in terms of economic development and securing its investment. I think the question really becomes back to us is what is our level of interest in being able to develop our over the horizon radar systems, being able to recognize vessels on the water, hypersonic missile detection. I mean, so I think really, I think the more policy question is about how does it rack and stack in terms of our prioritization as we look at North America, and I'll say that in a kind of a collective term. What is our prioritization of being able to prepare, to look, to have the sensors, and what's our response policies that are going to be based on different possible operation plans. So I think what you're noting is that, yes, there is a significant involvement and development within the Russian side. The question becomes, how do we rack and stack that prioritization in doing our own technological development, in particularly in contrast to the climate changes that we're experiencing. So from UAF, we call ourselves the American Arctic University, but there's a lot of science that goes on to how do we understand what's happening in the Arctic and what's the influences, and then how do we detect that and predict it.
So maybe I'd like to just add on, as the recent director of operations for NORAD, we do look very distinctly at Russians' radars in a very, so thank you for your service up in the north. I'll tell you that it's carried on in fine fashion right now. The Russian radar sources that are operating in the Russian Arctic are significantly defensive in nature. And this is in keeping with the Russian military mindset that this is all about, a defensive structure. And they even characterize their offensive operations worldwide as defensive in nature, as we see with the war in Ukraine and the rhetoric surrounding the war of Ukraine, whether it's at the strategic level or even at the tactical level, is seen as something that's defensive, something that protects the motherland. Whether or not those forces are being used for offensive operations or not, then becomes just a little bit of a tactical reasoning. But it highlights the importance of technology plays in the north. Whether that's in the development of indigenous communities and whether we can leapfrog them forward, not having to deal with diesel generators and bring them into the 21st century without having to deal with all of those middle industrial age things that they didn't have the benefit of doing, or whether it's the advance of over-the-horizon radar, polar and Arctic OTHR on the Canadian InSight are going to fundamentally change the way in which information dominance can be seen within the battle space. All that to give better warning in the future. What I think is going to be problematic is that these changes in the radar architectures and the threats are not going to fundamentally change the threat to the continents, whether it's Europe or North America, from Russia. So you can know that they're coming, but you can't defeat the threats. And this is where I think the conversations about the indigenous populations are more fundamental. NORAD and U.S. Northcom have gone towards a campaign plan focused on resilience, redundancy, and changing the calculus of the adversary. The idea here being is if we can broaden, disperse, do whatever it is to change the fundamental layout of your forces on the ground so that the calculus of them attacking means that the cost-benefit analysis is no longer good, then you actually are going to deter the enemy. It's deterrence via denial as opposed to the primarily American concept of deterrence via punishment, right? Don't touch me or I'll beat the crap out of you kind of thing. And it only works so far, and it has to work in the idea of your adversary that you can actually create that mindset. And that's why I think there's a significant link here between climate change, the environment, indigenous populations, resilience, and security. So I hope that answers your question. It's a great question. We have a question online. It's been up there for a while, so I'm just going to take it. Just as we did in Germany during the first Cold War and currently in Poland, the interaction with the local population concerning military maneuvers in the circumpolar high north, geography will be a definite factor. What push factors do military personnel need to know before conducting full-scale Arctic exercises? Let's start with you, Michele.
That if you want to partner with different populations, we need to start now, not a day before something is planned. There needs to be lead time. It takes time to build up relationships. Again, that issue of being humble, we need to go into, we need to work with them and recognize, again, that they are the experts in that terrain. We may have the military assets and that type of thing, but they get the terrain. For them, 60 below and living up there is just Tuesday. It's not extreme, it's not remote. They play bingo on Saturday nights at the Whaling Commission. I played with them. Their young girls play basketball in this, in the auditorium. We should be there with them. We should be there with them. We need to have a presence in these communities if we are welcomed, if we are allowed. and actually have a presence there all the time, not show up just when we want to pull off, a training or something like that. And I can tell you again, in terms of my experience of the communities of people, different populations I worked with up there, they were all very, very eager to partner with security organizations. And in fact, I think I told General Burkhead and Generals and Clancy as well, they were talking about, they literally asked me, does the American military know that the Russians attacked the Ukraine? Does the American military know that we are here, that we are Americans, that we are citizens, that we need information, we want to partner, we can help them, we are us, they are us, we're American, we want to help, and no one's reached out to us. I was told that many, many, many times during the whole Russian-Ukraine thing. They literally said, do they know that we border Russia? It's like, wow. That's the level that we're talking at about some of these conversations. Those types of conversations should not be where we are. We should already have very well-established relationships with these populations. Again, these are people in our various countries. They are citizens. They're not, it's not a foreign country where we're operating. Time, patience, humility, having cultural liaisons can be very helpful. Doing more to recruit and have people from these different special populations in the military can be very, very important. I worked with a lot of the elders who were children of people that were in the Alaska Territorial Guard. They were bemoaning that that program was not still up and running so that their younger people could be involved in that. So there's a lot of interest, I think, if these populations are recognized for their resilience, for their brilliance in how they function up there, absolute brilliance. Most of them, especially obviously the indigenous groups, they are the original winter warriors. They know what they're doing up there. They have a lot of knowledge to share with us. They want to partner. They're waiting to have respectful, equitable partnerships, meaningful partnerships established where they don't feel like they're being used or taken advantage of or just viewed as an asset, but that it's, it's an equal partnership.
James?
Yes, sir. So if I understand the question right, there would be three parts to the response. One is that we got to know what we're gonna do for a fight up there. So what is that in terms of land forces? And so we created the 11th Airborne Division in the United States at Alaska. So we don't quite understand what is Arctic warfare and what is that going to look like. So I think it's being able to understand that. The second one is that we have to have people in the environment, operating in environment. They've got to understand what does it take to be able to operate in 60 below. Or just even 40 below, and then piggybacking on what Michelle's saying is then establishing those partnership with indigenous communities, both in kind of thinking about in terms of censorship, not censors in terms of detection, understanding, relationship, but also that knowledge and skill development, because it's really a bi-directional relationship. Because there's a lot of things that they also want to learn and understand, such as leadership, management, economic development. So I would that's good.
Yeah, absolutely. And there was the issue I've been asked before. Well, how do we know that we're not exploiting? How do we know that we're not exploiting them? These types of awkward conversations that come up, but they're legitimate concerns. And one way to do that, again, as I mentioned, is to put them on payroll. Not everything has to be a volunteer. Hey, can you do us a favor? Can we meet for a few hours? Can you help us out? Thing. We can actually contract with tribes. The Department of Defense can, contract with different populations, different communities, different first responder organizations, whatever those groups may be, if we're looking for long, ongoing, regular technical assistance, technical advice. There are ways to do that depending on which populations we're looking for assistance from. And there's very much interest from them as well.
But I'll add a caveat onto that too, as well, though, is that there is a sense of fragility within rural communities. There's not a lot of bandwidth. So if 10 people want to go do a visit for an exercise, that takes a tremendous amount of resources from that village and that community. Right. So sometimes we talk about, well, if we could kind of large, hand over the map kind of picture about this is what they could do. That's an assumption in terms of the resources they have. They're extremely limited in resources. So tribal admin offices can, barely, just manage the day-to-day. So sometimes we have to think about what is the capacity and be able to have better fidelity on what that capacity is. Thanks.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. When we were there on the medical projects doing the COVID outreach in the villages, we would sleep. We would be totally independent with what we bring as teams. There might be 2 or 3 of us. We would sleep in the clinic itself on a floor with a sleeping bag. We brought our own water and our own food. And we're this is a very, very real consideration up there, again, because these communities are not well developed. There's not been a lot of development or infrastructure, so you've got to manage these logistics carefully.
We have a question from Brigadier General right here. Okay.
I'm on? Okay. The comment would be more to the question that tribal consultation, Dr. Morton, you mentioned tribal consultations are so important, and working with the corporations. When we say corporation, these are really savvy organizations, well-funded, with people who are planners and organizers, and so reaching out to the right person in the corporation or through tribal making sure that you have tribal consultation before you put foot on the ground is really important.
Yes, ma'am, and I would also add on that it's an obligation. It's not a good thing to do. It is a good thing to do, but it's an obligation. We have DoD, Department of Defense, U.S. Department of Defensive Instruction 4710.02 says, hey, you are required to do consultation. If anything that's going to impact that Native community is you have to do consultation well ahead of time before you even plan what you're planning to do. And unfortunately, it's not necessarily practice. And then the corporation in the new instruction does say that there is consultation obligations to corporation, which is a for-profit entity. But it's associated to their resources, in which they are the predominant landholders. The tribes do not own land, but anything that we are thinking about in terms of impact on land, that's subsurface, subterranean, as well as surface, which is predominantly used by village corporations, has an obligation for DoD service components to do that consultant. Thank you, ma'am.
Other questions from the floor? Right here.
So my question really is, we sort of have a poor history when economics and security impact or engage with indigenous populations, and I'm wondering as that happens in the Arctic, so I think it's kind of inevitable that economic and military security is going to take a higher priority in the Arctic. How do we do better, I guess, as a military and private sector in this scenario?
Yeah, fundamental, great question. It is, I think, working with these populations as true partners, not working for them but working with them as true partners. The consultation, the engagement with them, long before, now, during, after. There just needs to be a lot of very open communication, a lot of transparency. There have been challenges, sometimes even with search and rescue, disaster, emergency management types of issues. There was a major gas leak when I was up there from some of the private oil companies that were up there, and the village closest to that, they demanded constant input from the company. They wanted to know all the time, and when the company got tired of doing that after a few weeks, there became a huge amount of tension and anger and frustration, and then it ruins the reputation of that company for years, for generations potentially, because they didn't keep those open lines of communication. So transparency, site visits.
Yeah, and I would add, it is changing, right? So Alaska Native Corporation with ANSCA has really kind of changed how we're looking at economic development for indigenous communities, because of what what General referred to earlier is that there is a level of savvy and competency that are non-native people running corporations they're very involved into it. So I think you're seeing an emergence, a change that's taking place now, and that's why I think that's why I was talking about the economic development as one of the buckets, is because because there is petitioning and political legitimacy that's happening about, no, we want to have the deep port in Nome, and here's the reason why, related to some of the economic interests. But it's got to fit obviously within the strategic interest. Does that make sense strategically to put a deep port in there? And so I think there's advocacy that's emerging and greater legitimacy that's happening as we enter this kind of consciousness of how do we think about and talk about with Native communities and the assets that they have, and how can we do that collaboratively, but also from the Indigenous community, how are they petitioning, because they're global corporations, at least in Alaska, they're global. I mean, those are Doyon Corporation, the Arctic Slope Regional Corporation. I mean, those are global enterprises that have investments, so they're pretty savvy, and I think that's morphing, and I think some of the policies that's going to have to come out of that to be able to support, because now you're in that dicey area, right? You got a for-profit corporation that you can't give undue privilege to, yet have the response, that have the option for consultation. So I think we're sorting that out, and so we'll be come to see how that really shapes out.
I think this comment about them being very savvy, absolutely true. These are incredibly sophisticated populations, sophisticated government run operations and organizations. A number of the people now are going back for not just high school bachelor, doctorate degrees. I mean, you're dealing with some very sophisticated, very politically astute.
Stanford Law.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you'll find them terrific to work with as true partners again. They have a lot of knowledge, a lot of expertise, and a lot of interest. But again, recognizing the diversity within diversity, and there are different tribes, different tribal organization structures, corporation structures within different units. So it takes a while just to figure out which groups to be working with and how to proceed. It can be complex.
Yeah, which adds also additional conflict points, right? Additional friction points of how are you going to negotiate, whose sovereignty are you talking about? And that's where that kind of conversation of, how do we have a shared vision? What's that new narrative? What's an emerging narrative that can be bought into and saying, hey, this isn't all our best interests, and yet we can't move unilaterally.
Will, you had a thought on this?
We have laws in Canada about Canadian content and broadcasting, so I felt the need to interject a little into the answer. But just very quickly, I think one of the things that may also need to be acknowledged is that best practices or established norms of doing business generally by government may actually have to give way to other priorities when making these kinds of decisions in the North. And what comes to mind for me very specifically, a recent Canadian example, Canada alongside the United States is currently modernizing and updating the North Warning System, the radar system across the North. And back in the early summer when the federal government announced the first tranche of contracts for that project, they announced almost $500 million that was focused, or not focused, but was granted to Inuit-owned businesses. And so that was a really important kind of indication of the desire to make sure that this expenditure and that this economic activity is going to be directly benefiting stakeholders and rights holders in the North, even if it perhaps isn't the lowest bid, even if it wasn't a completely open bidding process. The kinds of norms that are best practice generally may not be the best practice in this specific context, and we need to make space for that and prioritize the benefits to Indigenous communities.
Mm-hmm. General.
That's where I wanted to go with exactly that point, because there are set-asides, and so when we prepare set-asides, we need to make sure we're not making them so onerous that no one could actually meet the goals of the set-aside. So it is important that we continue to use that as a method to bring Indigenous people and the tribal nations into the Arctic security piece, because there are corporations that can do that, or there are organizations that can do the work.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to take a question online. Specifically, Will, it covers your historical model on the possible reentry of Russia into the international system, post-Napoleonic France versus post-World War I Germany. But both of these involved fundamental regime change. Can you see the question coming? So do you see any possibility for cooperation with the Arctic and Russia under a weakened but surviving Putin regime, or a regime without Putin, but with one of his subordinates at the head? Or is cooperation contingent on Russia undergoing dramatic political change?
Oh, that's a great and very challenging question. I deliberately avoided making the comparison to two other obvious cases, which are Germany and Japan in the post-Second World War period, because those do not seem to me to be very applicable, because the circumstances that led to the modernization, democratization, and marketization of those societies was, of course, many years of American occupation. And I don't believe anybody sees that that's a viable model for Russia going forward. I'm agnostic on the question of whether regime change is likely as a result of Vladimir Putin's clear blunders in the Ukrainian context. His domestic legitimacy has suffered. He's facing blowback because of his mobilization. His international standing has suffered. He's been in office for 22 years. I mean, it's difficult to predict, but I would suggest that certainly cooperation would be easier if he were no longer leader of Russia. That seems likely to me. I don't know that we should put a lot of stock in that outcome. That's outside of my pay grade. But I would say that in a circumstance where my two assumptions hold, Russia's been defeated in Ukraine, but Vladimir Putin did not use nuclear weapons, that he would be in a position of such weakness and vulnerability that he would be prepared to cooperate with others in the international system, that he would have to by necessity. And I think that if push came to shove, if there didn't seem to be circumstances domestically within the Russian Federation, i.e. a mass social movement or a palace coup or something happening internally that was going to overthrow his leadership, that the wisest course of action for the West would be to continue to engage with whichever leader is in power in Moscow, and that I think we would find at least some degree of, as I say, by necessity, willingness to cooperate on his part. I think any non-Putin leader of Russia would be, all things considered, more likely to be cooperative, but we'll have to work with whomever is across the table.
Great answer. Other questions from the floor? Here, please.
Good morning. I'm Aditi, the editor for the Canadian Army Journal. My question is to Professor Greaves. Like, you present some very interesting arguments about, Russia re-entering the international order. And I would like to add one more assumption, again, something you've pointed out to, which is Russia's own willingness to cooperate. But at the same time, how do you factor in, the variable of trust deficit that we have seen in the recent times, with Russia undoing everything that's been ongoing in terms of the international order? At the same time, I have been a part of, comprehensive, confidence-building measures with Russia as a part of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, wherein it was all about, presenting Russia as a responsible nuclear power. But today we see everything undone after years and years of investing time and energy. So how do you see, that playing out? And my third point, and that would be my last. So how do you see, we've seen Russia use nuclear weapons and the threat of nuclear weapons as a weapon to threaten well-intentioned partners. How do you see Russia not doing the same thing when it comes to Arctic issues and using it as a card to actually play against well-intentioned partners? Thank you.
Thank you for those questions. There's no question that the Russian leadership has chosen to shred their own credibility, and that none of us should put much stock in promises made by a leadership that continues to deny that they've aggressively invaded their neighbor's sovereign territory, that denied as the tanks were rolling across the border that it was happening, that has tried to play us for fools. And I don't believe they've succeeded, but they've been very insistent on disrespecting various other parties to the conflict and in the international system. I mean, it's a hoary adage at this point, but at a certain point, you do need to start trusting again. I don't think it's in our own interest to remain indefinitely distrustful towards Russia on principle, but clearly that trust and the rebuilding of trust and the rebuilding of confidence will be a process that takes time, will be a process that requires verification, that requires some level of Russian cooperation, and to the extent that it's not forthcoming, trust and cooperation will be very difficult to achieve, and I don't think I'm naive about that. My assumptions are useful, particularly the first one, because in that scenario, Russia will be in a position of weakness. Russia is a shadow of the great power that it once was, right? And I think we have to be, I don't say that to celebrate the fact. I think it's an important analytical point. Russia has proven itself to be something of a paper tiger, and had they achieved their objectives in Ukraine, we would have to deal with them differently. They have not. For all their best efforts, they are failing in their own, their own chosen war. And so when that war ends, and if Russia has failed in its objectives, it will be in a position of weakness. It will be domestically weakened, internationally weakened, and its military will have been shown to not be capable of some of the things that we feared it was capable of. In that circumstance, I see a lot of opportunity and a lot of incentive for Russian actors to cooperate and to try to gain the benefits that a stable and improved relationship with the West might provide. The second thing I'd like to respond, though, which I think is very interesting, is that in the exact same context that Russia has been so belligerently aggressive in the European theater, there has still been this insistence on the Arctic as a region apart. There has still been this insistence on, just because we're invading our neighbor there doesn't mean we're going to invade these neighbors over here. Just because we have aggressive intent over here doesn't mean that we're aggressive and revanchist in the Arctic region. I don't think we should believe that on good faith, but I think what that reveals is a Russian national interest in the maintenance of a stable and non-conflictual Arctic. The fact that Russia has half the Arctic and is far more dependent on economic activity in the Arctic than any other Arctic state, to the tune of 20% of their GDP, it's vital to their national security and to their national economic well-being to have an Arctic that is, so to speak, open for business, but from which resources can flow and where capital can come in. And so I think that the Russian desire to maintain the Arctic as such a non-conflictual space is an important indicator of the opportunity that the Arctic provides as a potential bridge towards improved relations, but also of the potential leverage that the Western Arctic states have over Russia, because should we choose to act or deploy militarily or engage in activities in the region that might limit or inhibit the Russian capacity to extract and transport resources from that region, it will be of significant impact to Russia. And that's a card that I don't think we've played as yet quite prudently, but is an important one that we are holding on to. And in that context, negotiation should be possible. Thank you.
All right, we have time for one final question. Andrea.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I was just wondering if all of you could comment, maybe rather than thinking about state-on-state relations, the way to bring Russia back is to take advantage of indigenous populations and scientific working groups. After all, that's how we got to this road of the Arctic Council. So any comments on that?
Michele, sure.
I'm part of the University of Northern Iowa Arctic Center. In addition to being part of the War College, we're a National Science Foundation center. And it's been very interesting because with the Russian-Ukrainian attack, our center is probably half Russian, including indigenous Russian PhD scientists. And we are still meeting. It's been awkward. It's very tense, talking about the political situation. We basically know that we're going to be limited being able to do data and, field work in Russia, at least for a while. But it's been very helpful, I think, to continue to work with those folks, including the indigenous Russians, as people, as scientists, rather than members of a country that's invaded another, and trying to separate out the people from a government doing this hostile action. And they very much appreciate it. And I think we've become their therapists at times. They've been very, very upset and talk about what's going on in their home nation and been very upset about it.
James?
I just don't know what the political capital is for scientists and for indigenous people in terms of leverageability to be able to influence policies and decisions. I don't know. So for University of Alaska Fairbanks, we have the IARC, the International Arctic Research Center. And so we have a lot of relationships. I mean, we have a very good network with a number of Russian scientists and institutions in the Arctic. So I think there's a very collaborative relationship, and there's a sense of tension of concern of, hey, how do we weather this so we can get through to the other side of what's happening in the geopolitical spectrum. And then we also, as Michele referenced, is that there's many Yupik, Inuit people that have relations with people in Siberia. But again, I don't know, how that would really shape the re-entry process in terms of policy or security in that realm. Where it would be more inferential would be, being able to share information that influences predictability, modeling, weather modeling, oceanography modeling. I mean, those things would be some aspects that we could share that information and bridge some of that tension, or maybe mitigate some of that tension. But again, I'm not sure how they would substantially influence in a kind of a more political brokering dynamic.
Bill, did you have any thoughts?
I think James makes a really important point about cooperation between scientists and researchers on the one hand and indigenous peoples and organizations on the other. I think everyone can agree is important and desirable, but it's not clear how connected those entities would be to the higher levels of politics and political decision making. But I think, as with the historical precedent of the Cold War, as we've seen in other kind of track 2 contexts, it is important and it matters, and it can create opportunities, and it can provide a forum for messages to be communicated, and it can be a really important step or two in the direction of building that trust, and I think it's to be embraced for those reasons. What I would add, though, and this is maybe inspired by Mr. Hyder's comments this morning, I think there's also really important business opportunities that could similarly accomplish multiple objectives while facilitating improved relations. And here I think specifically of the tremendous similarities that exist between Canada and Russia. Of all the Arctic states, these two are in many ways the most similar in terms of the physical and ecological nature of their vast, sparsely inhabited northern regions. And from a Canadian business perspective, not my expertise, but I've been told by well-informed people, there are all kinds of opportunities for Canadian innovation and Canadian kind of business opportunities to sell to the Russian market, for instance, in the area of permafrost architecture and engineering. 40% of the buildings in the Russian far north and the far east are affected by permafrost thaw. It's a catastrophe. It's a disaster for the Russian people because they are on the front lines of climate change, despite being a petrostate, of course. And so in that context, there's opportunities for Canadian businesses to open up markets to export their goods and services to, but which will also meaningfully improve the human security of people in Canada, elsewhere, but in Russia, in the face of environmental disruption. And I think that those opportunities collectively can accumulate into something politically meaningful. Thank you.
Well, this has been a great panel. I want to thank our panelists for all their wonderful work, great insights. I'll tell you, as a practitioner of this national security thing, watching the world as a director of NORAD, I asked the question of the panel behind the scenes, walk me through this indigenous and climate change piece, because quite honestly, when I'm trying to defeat cruise missiles, I don't see the linkage, the inherent linkage. And the linkage comes back to, you don't have sovereignty in the Arctic if you haven't dealt with the indigenous populations. You're having a transactional relationship with what the indigenous populations and the effects of climate change can be. What can it do for you? And the reality is, no, all of these pieces are intimately linked. If you can't have economic development, you're not going to be able to have the cooperation that's going to enable you to have the sovereignty. And presence as part of sovereignty is linked to there. So all of these pieces combined, I want to thank you for these insights. It's enlightened all of us. Please join me in thanking our panel.
Thank you. And before you step off the stage, we have a few gifts for you to take along with you.